Hi everybody, welcome back to the Reaper 101 course here on YouTube. I'm Adam Steele, your host, and today we're talking about how to use third-party effects with Reaper. So VSTs, audio units, virtual instruments, all that kind of stuff, and some of the little bits you might need to know as you dive into that. If you want to check out the real, ultimate, absolute everything about Reaper, then I highly recommend you check out the Ultimate Reaper Guide on ProMix Academy. That's me with us going through something like 55 or more parts of absolutely everything about Reaper from start to finish, some really advanced stuff, and a full recording mix and master session with how to use Reaper through the entire thing. Check it out in the link below. So in the previous section, we talked about using Reaper's inbuilt effects, which turn up in the effects window. But what we didn't talk about really was getting your own separate plugins installed. Now, there are a plethora of effects out there, anything you can imagine pretty much, from every vendor you can imagine. So I certainly don't want to tell you what to buy or why, because everybody has their preferences. I've been known to chop and change in terms of favorites, in terms of EQs, compressors, virtual instruments, everything really. I mean, I've been a professional mix engineer for 20 years now, and I keep changing my mind on what works best, but that's just development as software moves along and as recommendations come up. What you will need to know is that you have to install everything, and Reaper has to find each plugin. Whether it's on Windows or Mac OS, Linux is a little different, I guess. You will have to run installers these days for pretty much every plugin that you will come across. There are some free plugins that will still use a single file. Those are quite rare though. Those are usually, especially on Windows, what we call DLL files, which is a single file that will drop into your plugins folder as a kind of drag and drop. But yeah, most installers will install a plugin file into the folder where Reaper expects them to be. And then if it needs any extra files, whether it's a virtual instrument with samples or any extra code or anything, it tends to put those separately in its own folder somewhere. Now, looking at this screen, the first thing that happens when you open Reaper after installing new plugins is that Reaper scans for new plugins and will run through them and give them a test. If they work properly, they will then open up in the effects window. So let's look at the effects window on mic. Let's click the effects button here. And if you're successful with your installation, it will have come up in this big long list here. On macOS, they support AU, which is audio units, which is the Logic format, VST, which is the old Steinberg plugin format, and now VST3, which is the much more modern version with some really clever kind of integrations in there. In terms of the sound, if you have 3 copies of the same plugin that are different types, they will all sound the same. Given the choice, I tend to pick the VST3 version because that seems to be the most advanced implementation of what kind of allows that separate effect to talk to Reaper and backwards and forwards. And there are some cool things that happen with that I'll show you later. But some of the plugins kind of communication in terms of efficiency for processor and all that kind of stuff, it's better with VST3, I have found in my experience. With the filter list on the side here, I can choose VST or VST3 or AU, and that will just whittle down this list to whatever I have installed. Now, as you can see, I have a lot of plugins here from Plugin Alliance, a lot of Isotope stuff, a lot of plugins from Acoustica. I have a lot more plugins as well on my bigger studio computers, but I didn't want to overwhelm my poor MacBook. Now, just opening a plugin is simple. You just double click it and it will open. Now, in this case, this is where we get into some of the things I wanted to talk about. This particular plugin that I've opened requires activation. It has just activated itself slowly, but a lot of the time you might need something like this. This is a regular old USB stick, and companies like Plugin Alliance and Waves, you can authorize their plugins using their authorization system that stops pirating to a computer, but I have found if you do that, It only takes the smallest hardware change to that computer and its machine ID, that is to say, the code that says, I am this computer, changes, and then you have to reactivate it and it can become difficult and you end up in customer support situations. So what I do is I have a USB stick that I plug in and then I format that and then have all my licenses activated to this USB stick. That also means that I can then take all my licenses for those plugins and take this, plug it into the studio computer, plug it into my home mix tower computer, and just carry on. So in this case, it seems that this particular plugin was also activated to this machine. But if I were to plug this in with any of the other plugins that require that, that would then simply not pop up. Like, let's say the Console 4000E. That's already come up with the license activated. The other one that you will see a lot is this one. This is an iLock. There are people in the industry who really don't like the iLock, to put it mildly. I personally don't mind it at all. I'm not a big fan, I'm not sponsored by them, I'm not like on the council of iLock or anything. But again, for my use case, I can put a lot of my plugin licenses on here and then move this in between my Mac and the PC behind me and the PC at home because I only use one at once. And so I can use a lot of my nice fancy plugins with no hassle. If I was to try and open an iLock plugin without this, let's see, what do I have? If I went to open Soothe 2 by Oak Sound, for example, one of my favorite plugins, it will ask, do you have this iLock? And I do. This is an iLock 3, which is a little silver one. The slightly older ones are the iLock 2. And I can plug that straight in. And that window will then go away. And the plugin will open as needed. When you buy any plugins that use the iLock system, you then have to activate those. And there are a few ways to do that. So I'm going to open my iLock license manager here. And so you can see this is the iLock License Manager program. Whenever you buy a plugin that uses iLock, you tell them what your email address is that you use for iLock, and that gets deposited in your account that you can see here. I've got quite a lot of them, but that's mostly because I've spent many, many years building up this collection. And so sometimes you can activate those to iLock Cloud, which means that you don't need an iLock dongle. I personally don't recommend doing that because if your internet isn't working for any reason, your programs will just stop. And so if you're out of service range with a laptop, or if you're at home and your internet goes off for any reason, whether your Wi-Fi cuts out, whether your internet connection just happens to stop working for 20 seconds, your entire project will just not work for that amount of time, and it can be quite embarrassing if you're working with a client. So as much as it's a nice idea, I don't tend to go for that. I still go for the old school USB iLock. So what I would have to do is once I have the plugin in my account, I would then right click on the plugin that I need and go to activate. And then I would choose the iLock dongle. Again, I don't like activating to a computer if I can help it, because I find that that can be dangerous. If this computer breaks for any reason, it's very difficult to deactivate a plugin without being able to access the machine. It's the kind of thing, if I'm away from the studio, like right now, for instance, there's an extra Mac at the back there, a very old one, which has the Dolby Atmos renderer. That is currently activated straight to that machine. I really should get another iLock for that, because if I need to activate the Dolby Atmos renderer on something like this Mac, I have to be here physically to deactivate that license, so that's back in my account, so I can then activate it here. It's quite possible and not too difficult if I'm here. If I'm not here, and if I'm at home in Studio B, that's a nightmare, because that's a 40-minute each way drive to do a thing to be able to use the software that I have. So yeah, I almost always, if possible, use the iLock dongle. Mine says ZDT TLC. That's kind of an insurance thing, zero downtime, so that if for some reason this gets lost or stolen or broken, I can get all my licenses back pretty quick, but you do have to pay extra money for that. Not everybody needs that. That's very much a professional thing. But I would hit activate. That would then activate onto the USB stick, and you can see a slightly smaller list of USB activated licenses here, which is everything that I tend to use on a daily basis. Now, in this particular episode, I'm not really going to show you how to use third-party plugins because each one is different and each one will be very much suited to your needs. So like if I hit play on Soothe here, this is a third take that goes, and this is appearing my original take. It's a really cool plugin and it's something that I use all the time, but this isn't a Soothe tutorial. This is just how to get started. So what I want to show you mostly is a lot of the specific settings that you might need to change in the options and settings window, because there's a lot to go at that you may never need to touch, but if you do, you need to know where it is. So I'm going to start with the VST tab, which is at the bottom of Reaper Preferences, because this is one of the key parts here. This big string of horrible looking numbers and letters, which has been made easier recently, is the list of all the folders where your plugin files might be. Often this isn't an issue, but especially with older plugins, there is a bit of a kind of Wild West thing going on, especially on PC, because originally the VST format was made for Cubase by Steinberg, and so there would be a folder in your program files called Steinberg, the people who make Cubase, and underneath that would be another folder, VST plugins. So very traditionally, it would be program files, Steinberg, VST plugins. I've not worked that way in a long time. My plugins tend to go program files, VST plugins. But if I'm installing from an old installer and it defaults to the Steinberg thing and isn't intelligent enough to look through the system preferences to find out where my general VST folder would actually be, then it will install plugins in the wrong place, and then when you open Reaper, it won't find them. So what I might need to do is go here and click on Edit Path List. This is new, and I can add a path. There's the click to add system VST paths, so things that are set by default can all populate this list, but I can also add a path. So any folder that I think might have VSTs in it that would be of use to me, I can now add into here and hit open, and that will add that to this list. Also, if I'm getting extra plugins in here that I really don't want because I don't want the doubles or the triples, for instance, it's quite common now not to want to use VST2 at all, because most plugins are VST3, and if you don't want the confusion of doubling up your list in Reaper with plugin versions that you don't want to use, you could just remove some of these plugin folders entirely. Once you've set up the folder lists, we then have to rescan. The tick box for scan new updated plugins on startup is always ticked. That never used to be a tick box that I can think of. That used to just be default. It's nice that you can now set it to not just look for new plugins every time, which might save a little bit of time on startup, or it means that you might just have a list of plugins that you want and do that later. But if we click rescan, that brings us up another set of options. The top one is rescan VST paths for new and modified plugins. This is a nice little kind of hack. If you are in the middle of mixing, you realize one of your favorite plugins isn't actually installed, you can download the installer, run the installer, and then click this button without ever having to even close Reaper, and the new plugin will appear in your list without having to quit and reopen. So if you've got a really complex setup going on and you don't want to have to close everything, that can save you some time. Further down is one that I've had before. Let's say that I install a new plugin and I forget that I don't have my iLock with me. The first time I go to run that, it's going to do a first scan. And so it will try and open the plugin and it'll come up with that iLock window we saw before of, do you have this iLock? And if the answer has to be no, and you have to hit quit, then that sends a fail message to Reaper that says, we couldn't open this plugin, it must be damaged. Which in a normal circumstance is quite fair. If you've got an old plugin that simply doesn't work, you don't want that then crashing your system. So it sets it was a fail, didn't work, not gonna do that. So if that kind of thing happens, then when you've got your setup set properly with things like iLocks installed, then you can clear the cache and rescan VST paths for all plugins. It's also quite useful if you've decided to delete and uninstall a lot of plugins like trials and that kind of thing, because then by clearing the cache, it's not going to be looking for plugins that no longer exist. It's not going to come up with any other kinds of errors. There is at the bottom a plugins that failed to scan. I think the one that I've got here, SPL Hawkeye, that might have been some sort of programming error. Eventide Quadrivox was probably the one where I didn't have the iLock plugged in, but I have the other version of that plugin. The VST version of Contact apparently, but I only use the VST3 version of that, so that's not a problem. But if you are finding that plugins aren't coming up in Reaper, even if you know you have the directory set here and you've rescanned, it might be worth looking in that plugins that failed to scan list. There are some extra settings here. Don't flush synthesizer plugins on stop reset and don't send note-offs. If you're the kind of person that's working with like arpeggios and synths, when you hit stop in Reaper, it will automatically send messages to those plugins to stop playing. If you want those to keep running, let's say you're doing some sort of sound design experiment and you want to keep going, you might want to have one of those ticked. Another one that's interesting is inform plugins of offline rendering state. Sometimes you'll find plugins have advanced features like oversampling is a good one. Some of the plugins that I use, they might use like 2 times oversampling when you're playing back, which is relatively low CPU usage. When you hit render, they shift to a higher gear, so to speak, with like 16 or 32 or 64 times oversampling, which is quite processor intense, quite processor heavy. But at the same time, when you're rendering, that's less important, but it does change the sound in some way. And if you need things not to change at all, you might want to untick that box. And then you will get the same on the output as you had that you were listening to. There are another couple of things in the plugins general tab here. You can change some of the things to do with appearance, auto opening effects windows, FX chain positioning, which is to do with kind of how they appear cascaded, so you'll see 1, 2, 3 plugins come up over the top of each other. The other thing I wanted to talk about is ARA. ARA is a relatively new feature that is very cool, that is part of VST3, and I only have a couple of plugins that support it, but it saves me a huge amount of time. Let's close Soothe and get rid of that. ARA is a software kind of thing where it skips the middleman. I used to use Melodyne a lot, and I still do sometimes. And what you used to have to do with Melodyne in Reaper is you would open up Melodyne, there would be nothing in it, and then you would have to press play at the start of your audio and transfer the whole thing into Melodyne, so then Melodyne could have a copy of it and could edit it with its own files in its own separate thing. What ARA does is it cuts out that entire process. So now if I open Melodyne on our track here with some vocals, and then hit thank you very much, goodbye, make it a little bigger, you can see that that's a representation of our audio. So these bits here, let's right click and zoom in, that is Melodyne's representation of these bits of audio at the top right here. And if I change the take on those, or if I move that, did you see that that just changed entirely in Melodyne? So you can see I've moved my audio left and right, so there are a couple of gaps, and those just updated in Melodyne because it sends messages straight through, backwards and forwards from Melodyne to Reaper and from Reaper to Melodyne in real time. So there's no more transferring, there's no more waiting. I can now change objects in Reaper that will then automatically update in Melodyne. Massive time saver. The other one that I use is Vocaline, and now Vocaline, again, you used to have to transfer audio in, which was quite a tedious process, and this has really saved tons of time. I can now do whatever I have to do in Melodyne and then just close it down and know that everything will be fine. If I later decide, oh, there's an extra breath here that I want to edit out, I can just edit that, and that will update in Melodyne and that breath will be gone. Previously, that wasn't the case. Once things were transferred into Melodyne, that was then permanent, and the only way to edit it would be to edit it in Melodyne itself or to start again. So ARA is a huge time saver there, and the only way to get ARA working is I specifically opened the VST3 version of Melodyne. See, I've got an AU version here, I've got the VST3 version there. Let's see if the AU version does ARA. It does not. So the windows don't open and resize properly. There's nothing in Melodyne, so I would have to hit the transfer button here and then hit play. This is a third. And then I had to hit stop and wait, and that's what we used to have to do with Melodyne every time. So let's just delete that. Whereas the ARA version, there was no need to do that at all. And so any changes we make saves a huge amount of time. Later on in the series, I'm going to talk about routing audio, especially there's going to be a whole section about drum routing for VST instrument drums, because that can be quite complicated, and getting that right is something that can really save you a lot of effort in terms of mixing down the line. But for now, if you're finding this interesting and you want to know the absolute nth detail, then do check out the Pro Mix Academy Ultimate Reaper Guide. The link for that is down in the description below. For now, thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.